Hello, I am Anawiltos, and today I am going to be talking about something that I've seen lately among some individuals engaged in power scaling and tiering, and that is a bit of a misconception on how multidimensional tiering works. Because essentially, the way multidimensional tiering works is it requires one dimension to be above another dimension in a way that it requires the lower dimension to be infinite, uh, or at least that it leads to something to be infinite over the lower dimension. Specifically, by that I mean if you take a zero-dimensional object, a point, and compare it to a one-dimensional object, for example, a line segment, you would have to say that even if it's only a segment of a line and not an infinite line in itself, the point mathematically would have to go an infinite number of times in order to fill up that line segment. And therefore, a one dimensional character in fiction would be infinitely more powerful than a zero-dimensional character in fiction. Now, that's not including hacks and other things involved. Now, then, if you take a one-dimensional line segment and compare it to a two-dimensional square, you would need an infinite number of line segments to fill up that square, and that would mean that a two-dimensional object or a two-dimensional character is infinitely more powerful than a one-dimensional character. Now you go to the next step in three dimensions, and there you go. But when you go to the fourth dimension, that's where a lot of people get tripped up on this, because they're not realizing that there has been a parallelism up to this point, and that is that it is relating to spatial dimensions, as in the physical size of something leads to this kind of dimensional tiering. Now, there are other kinds of dimensional tiering, but for this specific kind of dimensional tiering, we're talking about physical size. So if someone is talking about this kind of this kind of dimensional tiering, this kind of power scaling, and says something is four-dimensional, what that means would be that an object is spatially four-dimensional, um, and that would mean that just like how there's length, width, and height, there is an additional element to fully analyzing the size of the object. As such, the object is technically speaking infinitely larger than any three-dimensional object. And just as a bonus, theoretically speaking, if you had four-dimensional vision, you would be able to see both the inside and the outside of a three-dimensional object. Just like with three-dimensional vision, looking at a flat two-dimensional object, you can see both what's inside as well as the edge of the two-dimensional object, or one-dimensionally looking from a two-dimensional perspective, you would be able to see the two endpoints of the object and everything in between. And that's just another general rule for how spatial dimensions work in tiering. Now, why am I bringing this up? Where is it where people mess up on this? Well, what I'm specifically talking about is when people take time as a valid fourth dimension in this type of tiering. Now, the reason time doesn't really work unless it's in a certain condition, it is because it doesn't follow the same parallelism as the previous objects that we've talked about. Because the previous objects, it's talking about the physical size of an object, while with time, you're really going into a different kind of dimension. So, because, for example, a human being, if you're talking about time as a dimension relevant to power scaling, a human being, of course, has that fourth dimension, because a human being does not remain static, but has a sequence of events in its existence. Now, when you move that up to time travel. Let's say Marty McFly goes into the past, but he still experiences time events sequentially. It's just that he goes into the past, and technically speaking, uh, from in the Back to the Future lore, it would all be sequential, even though his existence from the perspective of others might not be sequential. From his own perspective, his existence is sequential. And as such, if you really think about it, this doesn't make someone who time travels invulnerable. Therefore, it doesn't make that person infinitely powerful over the other dimensions. For example, if you're four-dimensional, you can manipulate both the inside and the outside of a three-dimensional object. Meanwhile, if you're just time traveling, that doesn't really allow you to surpass the three dimensions, because you can still be wounded three-dimensionally and affected three-dimensionally, and that is something that's very important to note. The same thing with being able to change the past, in a sense, doesn't make someone, doesn't put someone that extra fourth dimensional tier up. Now, when you get a bit more complicated with it, you could go into multiple temporal dimensions, and that's not really something I want to talk about right now because it's very complicated. But another way you could go about this is contemporaneity, in the sense that someone's existence is non-linear but eternal. And this is a concept that was introduced to me from theology. So let's say you have an individual who interacts with all time simultaneously from his perspective, but from the perspective of everyone else, it looks like sequential events. And that would be, I guess, a form of infinity and adding a dimensionality. But there's a difference between well, actually, it wouldn't add a dimensionality, because there's a difference between being infinite in one dimension and having an extra dimension. I think that difference is a very important difference to be made. And technically speaking, if we're talking about dimensionality, the qualifications for something even being a dimension, it can be really anything. Anything that is measurable, anything that is quantifiable, even something that has maybe a relative value rather than a quantifiable value. For example, humor. Let's say you have two two objects, and one object in a story has no humor at all, but has three spatial dimensions. And then you introduce an object that has humor, and the fallacy here would be implying that since this object has a dimension that the other object does not have, that this object then is infinitely more powerful than the other one. And that's really what I'm trying to have people avoid here. Just because someone can travel through time, just because someone can change the past, doesn't mean that that person is one up in the dimensional tier. Because technically speaking, you could have any number of dimensions, but for it to be one up in a direct sense, it would have to be a dimension of the same type. You need to have that philosophical parallelism of having a line segment, a square, a cube, and then a hypercube, or a tesseract, as some would say. And I know this because I do like to do four-dimensional math from time to time, It's something that always really messes with my head trying to do multi-dimensional math, but it's a great pastime. So anyway, thank you all for watching. Hopefully I helped out people who were confused about power scaling and helped debunk some mistakes people were making. And if, for example, someone has something to say, maybe I said something that was incorrect, or maybe something that is disagreeable to you, or maybe you'd just like to maybe collab with me on YouTube, please give me a comment in the comment section below, or you can go on the description page of my YouTube channel and find the email address you find there to give me an email. So anyway, that will be all for today. Hopefully this has been informative, and I will be seeing you all next time on Wiltus over and out.